Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Victor Emmanuel Nature Tours webinar. I'm Ben Reynolds, host and organizer of today's event. Thank you for joining the presentation today. We are delighted to offer this educational presentation about sparrows and vent tours, and we hope you enjoy today's topic on East is East and West is West, the sparrows of winter with Rick Wright. During the session, all attendees may ask questions, but please note that questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. However, if you have any technical questions during our session, I'll try my best to answer them in real time so you have the best viewing experience. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on demand anytime at your convenience. A link to the recording will be delivered to you in an email in the next few days. Now back to our feature presentation. Rick Wright is a widely published author and sought-after lecturer and field trip leader. A native of southeast Nebraska, Rick studied French, German, philosophy, and life sciences at the University of Nebraska before making a detour to Harvard Law School. He took the PhD in German languages and literatures at Princeton University in 1990, then spent a dozen years as an academic, holding successive appointments as assistant professor of German at the University of Illinois, reader in art and archaeology at Princeton University, and associate professor of medieval studies at Fordham University. Rick has been leading vent tours for 6 years that combine birds, nature, and culture. His numerous scholarly publications include 2 books on the Latin animal literature in the latter Middle Ages. Among Rick's recent books are the ABA Field Guide to Birds of New Jersey and the ABA Field Guide to Birds of Arizona. His Peterson Reference Guide to American Sparrows was published in 2019. He is also the co-author with Sanford Sorkin of Watching Birds in Montclair and Watching Birds in the New Jersey Meadowlands. Especially interested in the history and culture of birding, he is hard at work on a study of hummingbird collecting in France from the 16th to 19th centuries. In his spare time, he teaches Latin courses online at the Padilla Institute, and he lives with his family, Allison Berenger and Avril Huang, in northern New Jersey, where he offers private birding tours to the marshes, woodlands, and ocean beaches. We are thrilled to have Rick present about identifying sparrows of winter. We hope you enjoy the webinar. Without further ado, we will turn to Rick's presentation.
Thank you, Ben. Am I sharing my screen correctly, Ben?
Here comes the control.
Thank you. And I believe that we are, in fact, sharing. Nice to see everyone this afternoon. We birders lay claim to any number of worthy and high-flying scientific motivations, but let's face it, a lot of the impetus that drives us into the field is an unquenchable thirst for novelty. You may have seen thousands of bird species around the world, and among them you certainly have hundreds of favorites. But who among us doesn't turn away in a flash for the chance at a glimpse of something new? We call that novum, tellingly enough, a life bird, privileging the role of the once unseen in vivifying our pursuit of the feathered. It's no wonder then that we birders are such enthusiastic travelers. Even the most desultory of observers will sooner or later have seen most of what their local area has to offer, and they turn their attention to rarities, always in search of that jolt of the novel. Soon enough, though, we're reminded that there's a reason they're called that. Rare birds, it turns out, are rare, and the rush of novelty becomes all too infrequent on our home turf, no matter how comforting and enjoyable it is. And so if the birds won't come to us, we go to the birds. New places, new sightings, new experiences. Today, though, as 2020 draws to its long-awaited end, we look back on 9 months of what in a bird would be called permanent residence. And we look forward, all of us, to a new year in which our own migrations are likely to take off only slowly. As a result, we have all, to some extent, returned to our birderly roots, and our notions of the scarce, the rare, the new have had to be adjusted. Our focus has shifted back to the search for novelty on a much more local scale. And this time of year, late autumn and the first days of winter, this time of year novelty means vagrants, birds that have, for whatever reason, strayed from what we think of as their normal range to appear in a place where they are unexpected or rare or new. As someone once said, birds have wings and they fly. And so almost any bird can theoretically appear almost anywhere in the world. Though the science of avian vagrancy is still not far out of its infancy, there are a few obvious generalities, geographic and temporal, that seem to hold. Fall and winter, that is to say right now, are the most productive seasons for the seeker of vagrants in North America. The breeding season is long past, and adult birds are no longer burdened by their attachments to a territory, a nest, or their young. All of those young birds swell the autumn populations of migrants, and their exuberance and their inexperience on the way south increases the likelihood that one or the other of them will, as it were, take a wrong turn. Presumably, by the time spring arrives and it's time to return to the north, most of those young strays have regained their orientation, or they've paid the ultimate price, splashing their faulty navigational instincts right out of the gene pool. One phenomenon that has drawn comment almost from the beginning of American ornithology is the geographic imbalance in the origin of vagrants across the continent. Given the prevailing winds in North America, one should expect vagrancy to disproportionately involve Western birds blown east. In fact, though, it's just the other way around. Classically, Eastern birds are far more numerous and far more diverse as strays west to the Pacific coast than are their Western counterparts on the Atlantic. If you doubt it, a quick review of the autumn and winter changing season summaries in North American Birds and its predecessor titles is powerfully convincing. Just tally up the column inches devoted in each issue to Western birds east and to Eastern birds west, and you'll see what I mean. The direction of the winds and the greater density of observers in the east make this seem like a paradox, but there is a cogent explanation. First, there are simply more individual birds breeding in the east than in the west. Among the land birds, there are far fewer long-distance migrants in the west than in the east. Obviously, a bird traveling from Idaho to Sonora has fewer chances to go astray than does, say, one moving seasonally between Pennsylvania and the uplands of Colombia and Ecuador. And then there's the fact that thanks to the history of glaciation on the American continent, many of what we conventionally think of as eastern birds actually breed quite far into the west in the boreal forests of Canada and Alaska. In some cases, farther west than their so-called western counterparts. Thus, for example, Connecticut warblers breed farther west than Virginia's warblers. Rusty blackbirds breed farther west than Brewer's blackbirds. Yellow-shafted flickers breed farther west than red-shafted or gilded flickers. Myrtle warblers breed farther west than Audubon's warblers. And slate-colored juncos nest in abundance much closer to the setting sun than do any others of their so-called western dark-eyed junco relatives. The slate-colored junco breeds west well into Alaska. Most birds from even that westernmost portion of the summer range appear to follow an ancestral route on the autumn migration. These sparrows move east before moving south to spend the winter in the eastern half of the United States. Some of them, however, seem to move straight south, resulting in low-density wintering populations in the interior west and even on the Pacific coast. Slate-coloreds in the west occur at very low densities as far south as northern Sonora, but they are a reasonably good winter bird by local standards just about anywhere west of the Great Plains. Adult males are easily identified. They are the default junco, even I suspect for many of us who did not grow up with the slate-colored as our local junco kind. The adult male's dark gray head with little or no contrast between the head and the breast and the back is sharply set off from a bright white oval belly, a plumage pattern unlike that of any other sparrow, or for that matter, any other North American bird. Now, before we go on, it might be a good idea to forestall any possible taxonomic objections. As of half an hour ago, the American Ornithological Association's North American Checklist Committee recognized only a single species of dark-eyed junco. That species, though, comprises something like 14 recognizable subspecies in the center column here. Those 14 subspecies are gathered into a number of groups, the right-hand column here, and those groups roughly correspond to what we used to call field identifiable forms. They are largely congruent with the pre-1973 classification that recognized as full species the slate-colored, the Oregon, the pink-sided, the gray-headed, and the white-winged juncos. Now, why should we birders hold on to these outmoded labels? Why wouldn't we simply resign ourselves to what is now a nearly 50-year-old lump and simply call them all dark-eyed juncos and be done with it? The reason is this: hobbies have as their only goal the accumulation of knowledge for its own sake. This is as true of the birder as it is of the iris breeder or the Studebaker collector. Even what might seem to the layperson trivial is significant to us as an addition to our storehouse of expertise. At the same time, hobbies are also, in some sense, about love. What kind of inexcusably lazy hobbyist would we be? What kind of unforgivably inattentive admirer if we failed to seize every opportunity to acquire more knowledge, and more detailed knowledge, than is officially required? The various flavors of dark-eyed juncos may not count on a carefully curated list of species tallied, but still we care. And still we search for the odd one out in the industrious little flocks scratching away beneath our feeders. As I mentioned a moment ago, slate-colored juncos, those dark gray and white eastern and northern birds, are low-density winterers virtually throughout Western North America, always welcome, but not quite rare. Their western and southern counterparts, on the other hand, are decidedly scarce in the east, and finding one always makes for a red-letter day for the sparrow watcher. The most widespread and the most numerous of these so-called Western juncos is the Oregon junco. For most of us, west of the Great Plains, this is the default snowbird. Now, one often hears birders speak of the Oregon as a subspecies of the dark-eyed junco, but as we've just seen, that sloppy formulation conceals the fact that the Oregon kind itself shows considerable geographic variation, with 7 or 8 currently recognized subspecies within the group we call the Oregon junco. Thus, when an excited eastern birder tells you that they've seen a junco of the Oregon subspecies, they should instead more carefully and more precisely be speaking of a junco of the Oregon subspecies group, or a junco of an Oregon subspecies. Yes, it's fussy, but punctilious language is part of that thirst for expertise that makes us start looking at birds in the first place. Those 8 Oregon subspecies are generally indistinguishable in the field, and so we can talk about them all as a unit, a group, in terms of field identification. One clue that sparrow watchers often overlook is size. Yes, sparrows are small birds in the grand scheme of things, but they are not uniformly small. The tiny, slender brewer sparrow is no heavier than a chickadee, while the great hulking Abert towhee, the largest sparrow north of Mexico, outweighs most Baird sandpipers. Likewise, there's considerable variation in size and bulk among the various dark-eyed junco flavors. The slate-colored junco is a medium-large junco, appearing in the field to fall between a song sparrow and a white-throated or white-crowned sparrow in size. Oregon juncos are the smallest of the juncos. They're barely larger than the average song sparrow of the East, and they are noticeably diminutive when they're mixed with slate-colored or other juncos. Even in a brief glimpse, even in flight, that size difference can be a first clue that there is an Oregon outlander in the flock. Seen well, male Oregon juncos are every bit as distinctive as male slate-coloreds, but where slate-coloreds are elegantly somber, male Oregons are, at least by junco standards, a riot of color. The dark gray, even black head and breast contrast with a bright brown back and orange sides, creating an aspect sometimes reminiscent of an eastern towhee. As is often the case in bird identification, though, it isn't just the colors themselves that are essential. Faced with a candidate for an out-of-range Oregon junco, it's most important to note how those colors meet in the bird's plumage overall. The dark head and breast are sharply cut off from the white of the belly and from the brown or chestnut of the back. Often, when I run across an Oregon-like junco of uncertain affiliation here in the East, I pay closest attention to that last characteristic, hoping to see a neat, unblurred line of demarcation between the blackish nape and the brown back. Any bleed of the brown onto the hind neck shakes my confidence. In both the slate-colored and the Oregon juncos, there is a stark contrast between the gray or black breast and the white belly. The way that those two colors meet differs the two junco kinds, though, and this is a mark that holds not just for the adult male, but for females and young birds as well. This difference has been known for many, many decades, but it was poorly illustrated in most of the canonical field guides of the past, and it's a difficult characteristic to describe in words. Traditionally, the border between breast and belly has been described as convex in the slate-colored junco and concave in the Oregon, or concave in the slate-colored and convex in the Oregon. It depends, obviously, on whether you're concentrating on the dark color or the light. I think of it in slightly different terms, terms that may work for some of you as they do for me. The underparts of slate-colored juncos are marked by smooth, rounded curves, the white of the belly intruding into the dark breast in a broad, gentle arc. The effect reminds me of an egg warmer, one of those crocheted kinds meant to keep a boiled egg hot. Think of the white of the underparts as the egg, the dark of the upper parts as the warmer, tightly settled atop the egg, but not quite covering it entirely, so that the big end of the egg sticks out in front. In the Oregon junco, the division between the black and white is quite different. Where the slate-colored's underparts are laid out along gently sinuous lines, the Oregon is all angles, the black of the breast resisting, as it were, the intrusion of the white. On the supine bird, the black forms a clear bib with the white extending forward or up in a point at the side of the breast. That, of course, is a difficult view to come by outside of a museum drawer, but there is an easier way to assess it in the field. In a true Oregon junco like this one, the pink or orange of the upper flank meets the sides of the breast and the shoulder of the wing in a sharply defined triangle, a colorful corner where black, white, and orange come together. Just as with the line setting off the nape and the back, if this color corner is smudgy, irregular, or blended, I begin to worry. I worry, of course, because these two juncos, the Oregon and the slate-colored, are notorious for interbreeding where their summer ranges overlap. Apparent hybrids and back crosses often exhibit intermediate colors and patterns. The flanks can be a mix of gray and pink, the back can be muddy brown, and the points of contact between the different colors can be messy, showing neither the smooth curves of the slate-colored nor the sharp angles of the Oregon. Birds like that are abundant on the eastern Great Plains, And in many flocks, these apparent intragrescents outnumber pure Oregons and pure slate-coloreds combined, whatever pure means when we're talking about juncos. It's bad enough in adult males, but in the case of females and young birds, it can be extremely difficult to decide whether one is looking at the hybrid offspring of parents belonging to two different subspecies, or simply a very brown slate-colored or a very gray Oregon. If the perfect is the enemy of the good, in bird identification, certainty can be the enemy of enjoyment. The other western juncos are much rarer in the east than the Oregon, which occurs every winter east of the Mississippi, its numbers dwindling to become a genuine rarity on the Atlantic coast. An active and lucky birder here in New Jersey, for example, may see one good Oregon in a winter, or none. The same pattern of Oregon and slate-colored hybridization that can make definitive identification challenging is also behind one of the many junco mysteries. In the first part of this series, a few weeks ago, we mentioned the Cassiar junco in connection with a watercolor by John James Audubon. I argued then that Audubon's model was an unrecognized Cassiar junco, and that bird was actually not formally described for another 100 years in 1918, and not until 1941 was it finally recognized as a legitimate subspecies, cismontanus, the Cassiar junco. Occupying only a small breeding range in British Columbia and Alaska, the Cassiar junco is believed to have had its origin in a mixed population of Oregon and slate-colored juncos, whose hybrid descendants went on to breed with each other, eventually stabilizing the population morphologically to form a distinct subspecies. The classic male Cassiar junco is a beautiful bird. Picture the pattern of an Oregon junco, the nape neatly set off from the back and the upper flanks meeting the breast sides in a sharp corner, but remove the warm brown tones to make the bird a beautifully elegant study in soft black and white and gray. Birds like this are common in the mountains of southern British Columbia in winter, and they're fairly common in most areas of the interior West and on the Great Plains. They're regular, but even scarcer than Oregon juncos to the East Coast. There's always a difficulty, though, whatever kind of junco you're talking about. In the case of a Cassiar-like junco, seen in winter away from that expected western range, it is, strictly speaking, impossible to be certain that it actually originated on the actual breeding grounds of that actual subspecies. It's possible instead that that bird is the chance hybrid product of the pairing of slate-colored and Oregon juncos in some other zone of contact. This is why east of the Great Plains, we usually speak of an apparent Cassiar junco, or a Cassiar-like junco, or a Cassiar-kind junco. In any event, these birds are spectacular and conspicuous when they do show up in the east. Females pose even greater problems. I officially became a skeptic in the matter of identifying out-of-range female Cassiar juncos when I examined this New Jersey specimen at the American Museum. It was claimed as the first state record of the Cassiar. Lying there on her back in the drawer, she is definitely a junco and probably a female, but it was then and it remains now beyond me why this smudgy pile of brown-gray feathers and skin was identified as a Cassiar junco and not as an Oregon junco or just about anything else. There are female Cassiars that exhibit the same pattern as males, just in less contrasting shades of black and gray, but this New Jersey bird here does not inspire confidence in my ability or anyone's ability to distinguish in the field between dull Oregon and bright slate-colored and genuine Cassiar juncos in this plumage. What you want to see is a bird like this, a handsome, well-marked male. To my mind, the most beautiful of all the dark-eyed junco kinds, the pink-sided, is an extraordinarily rare bird east of the Great Plains and west of the Rockies, and I believe it is vastly overreported. As John Dunn and Kimball Garrett pointed out some years ago now, this bird was very poorly illustrated in field guides and the technical literature for a very long time. As a result, pale Oregon juncos, female Oregon juncos, and any junco that makes you think there's just something not quite right about this one, they all find themselves confidently misidentified as pink-sided juncos. Fortunately, there's little excuse for that nowadays. We have an abundance of correctly labeled paintings and photographs available in books and online. In a genuine pink-sided junco like this one, the gray of the head and the brown of the back are equal in saturation. That is to say, neither color is noticeably darker than the other. The back lacks the strong reddish tone often visible in Oregon juncos, and the head is noticeably pale. In many males, an otherworldly pastel blue-gray, lighter than in any Oregon junco. Famously, the lores, that small area between the bill and the eye on each side of the head, the lores are jet black, giving the bird a cross-eyed look if you see it head on. This is a good field mark, but more than a few female Oregon juncos can show darker lores too, especially in my experience when you're trying your very hardest to find a pink-sided in the flock. The best mark of all, though, is found in both male and female pink-sided juncos. The gray on the underparts of a slate-colored junco and the pink or orange on the underparts of an orange junco are the same width at the rear of the flanks as they are in the front, where the colors meet the breast. In a classic pink-sided junco, the pink is evenly broad until just before it meets the breast, where it abruptly expands toward the center to form a blob. In not a few birds, most of the males, those blobs meet at the center of the lower breast, creating a broad, almost continuous zone of pink between the white belly and the pale gray hood. Perched upright in a tree, those birds can bring to mind a western bluebird or a leisurely bunting. Finding one under the feeder, whether you're in California or in Maine or in their normal range, guarantees a good day. The southeastern edge of the pink-sided junco's breeding range almost meets the northwestern edge of the white-winged junco's nesting area in the Black Hills, the Pine Ridge, and a few spots in southeastern Montana. The vast majority of the entire population of white-winged juncos winters between the Nebraska Panhandle and southeastern Colorado. And genuine records of this bird, even just a few score miles east or west or south of there, are decidedly infrequent. When they're seen in flocks with slate-coloreds or Oregons, white-winged juncos are often noticeably large and pale, with long, heavy, slightly blue-tinged bills. They have much more white in the tail than other juncos, and the white is sometimes visible even at the tip of the folded tail, and the superior amount of white is often quite conspicuous in flight. And some of them even have white on the wing. Not all of them, though. A decent percentage of white-winged juncos of both sexes and all ages show no white wing bars at all in the field or in the hand. And in many others, those wing bars are incomplete, represented only by scattered white tips in the wing coverts. That's bad enough, you might think, but what's worse is that white wing bars are not terribly rare in other junco kinds, including the slate-colored. Wing-barred Oregon juncos, like this one, hardly pose an identification puzzle. But even experienced observers can be momentarily misled by a nice gray slate-colored with neat white bands on both wings. Confirming the identification of a vagrant white-winged junco in the field will always be a challenge, requiring close attention to size and bill shape and color, and above all to the wing pattern. I see juncos with white wing bars in our New Jersey yard every winter, but if ever I suspected that I was feeding a true white-winged junco here, cameras and mist nets would be the tools of choice. Breeding in the southern Rocky Mountains, the gray-headed junco tends to move straight south into Arizona and New Mexico, Sonora, and Chihuahua for the winter. Strays to the east and to the west are very rare, but they do show up. There are records west to the coasts of California and Washington, and east as far as Ohio and Ontario. To sparrow watchers' great relief, this is an easy bird to identify, by junco standards at least. While all of the kinds we've discussed up to this point all show a more or less clear-cut black or gray hood, in the gray-headed junco, the medium gray of the head continues onto the underparts with no noticeable demarcation between the upper breast and the lower breast. The belly in most individuals is only slightly wider. The back is bright cinnamon brown, a sharply defined, colorful triangle clearly set off from the head and wings. The sexes are sufficiently similar in plumage that it's rarely safe to name one as a female and another as a male. Unsurprisingly, gray-headed juncos hybridize with other juncos, especially with the pink-sided, which occupies the range just to its north. These hybrids were originally described as a distinct species called the Ridgway junco. Their plumage combines the bright, rusty back triangle of the gray-headed with the colorful pastel flanks of the pink-sided. The head, breast, and belly grade smoothly from gray to dull whitish, immediately distinguishing these very attractive birds from any Oregon junco. Ridgway juncos are extremely rare as vagrants outside of the usual winter range of the gray-headed, but they can be fairly easy to find at feeders in the Southwest at that season. The remaining kind of dark-eyed junco is the one that many birders know least. That at least is true of me. The redback junco breeds in the mountains of east central Arizona and west central New Mexico. Most individuals spend the winter on or just downslope of the breeding grounds. There are a few records of vagrants farther south in those states, but all in all, this is probably the least likely of the dark-eyed juncos to stray significantly from its normal range. The red-backed differs from the gray-headed junco in its darker bluish-gray bill and the tendency of the rich cinnamon of the back to spill over into the innermost flight feathers of the wing, which are always gray and sometimes always gray in the gray-headed and sometimes gray in the red-backed. The red-backed junco also has an unusual song, an unjunco-like song, more complex and with more whistled notes than the dull, uneven tremolo of the other dark-eyed juncos. If this description reminds you of something, the dark bill, the sometimes rusty tertials, the complex whistled song, you're in good company. The redback junco was lumped at the species level with the other dark-eyed in 1974, but it had been originally described as a subspecies of the yellow-eyed junco, and it appears in various older incarnations of the AOU checklist lumped with that species. There is at least one record of hybridization between the red-backed and the yellow-eyed juncos, suggesting that the similarities we find so striking aren't lost on the birds either. Normally, we could stop here with the dark-eyed juncos, but this past fall and the winter just begun, we've witnessed unprecedented mobility in a bird that ornithology has always thought of as sedentary, the yellow-eyed junco. Even in harsh winters, its downslope movement in Arizona and New Mexico brings it hardly more than a few hundred yards lower than the breeding grounds beneath the ponderosa pines. This year, though, numbers have been discovered in the lowlands of southeast Arizona, for the most part not associated with other juncos. Southern New Mexico also had birds, while at least two made their way as far east as El Paso in September and October. Most shocking of all was a single individual discovered in November in west central Kansas and still present there at least up until Christmas Eve. That Kansas bird is so far out of range as to make one wonder whether it started its bizarre journey in the Sky Islands of Arizona and New Mexico, or perhaps south of the Mexican border in the eastern Sierra Madre, or even beyond. This has certainly been one of the most startling phenomena of the birding year, and I'm eager to see where the next wildly out of range yellow-eyed shows up. Maybe it will be beneath your feeder. The center of the birding world is right where we happen to be at the moment. And as long as we're all centered at home, we can wait for the birds to find us. If you're lucky enough to have juncos at your feeder, wherever you are, take some time to study them. Not only are they by far the most charming sparrows of winter, but those tame flocks sometimes harbor secrets. Maybe this is the winter when your junco gang will contain a rarity. In the next installment of this sparrow series, we'll be looking at 3 of the family's most stereotypically brown and streaky birds, the song, the fox, and the savanna sparrows. They're less given to vagrancy perhaps than the juncos, but they are every bit as fascinating in their variety too.
Rick, thank you for that presentation.
Thank you, Ben.
Oh, Rick, can you put your screen back on? There we go. So January 14th, in 2 weeks from now, Spots and Streaks, Identifying Song, Fox, and Savanna Sparrows with Rick Wright. Think of a sparrow, and most people think of something small, brown, and streaky. The juncos, towhees, and brush finches might disagree, but that description is right on the nose for 3 of the commonest sparrows in North America, the song, fox, and savanna. Join Rick Wright and Vent for an exploration of the sometimes challenging field identification of these birds in your region. Now I'd like to take questions from the audience. Paul has asked if the first webinar of the sparrows is available to watch somewhere. And yes, it is. It is found on our Victor Emmanuel Nature Tours YouTube page and our Go to Stage page. And Paul, I will send you a link to both of those channels after this webinar. Sue asked, what time is the Spot and Streaks webinar on the 14th? It's at the same time as this webinar here. Will be at 1 p.m. Central. Florian says, thanks for the presentation.
Thank you. I'm glad you were here.
Marilyn has a question. In New England, how many species are common?
How many species of birds or sparrows?
Maybe Marilyn, can you clarify what you were trying to count as common? Junco.
Of junco, if we follow the classification of the American Ornithological Society, New England has only 1 common species of junco, and that is the dark-eyed junco. Of the dark-eyed juncos in the northeastern US and eastern Canada, the slate-colored junco is the only junco kind that is common. There are also annual records of Oregon juncos, one scattered here and there throughout New England, and any of the other junco flavors found in New England is a really important find. It's a big deal to see something other than a slate-colored or an Oregon junco in New England. Slate-colored, abundant in the winter and nesting locally in New England, and Oregon rare but regular every winter.
Charlene says, thank you. I'll have an easier time with discerning Oregon versus slate colored in the future.
Good to hear that. Good.
Marcia says, good delineation of the juncos. When do you think they will be split by the ABA?
When will the juncos be resplit? You know, I have come over the last couple of years to believe that it is unlikely. When I was working on the Peterson Reference Guide to Sparrows, I spent a lot of time, obviously, trying to keep up with the scientific literature on the sparrows, which nowadays means, in large part, genetic literature on the sparrows. And I've continued, in the case of the juncos, to try and keep up with that literature. And it turns out that in the geological time frame, the evolution of the various junco kinds is quite recent, and it doesn't seem likely that we should expect any new splits among the dark-eyed juncos anytime soon. The yellow-eyed juncos, that's a different matter. Over just the last couple of years, the Baird junco, which is a junco with yellow eyes from Baja California, has been resplit from the yellow-eyed. The Guadalupe junco has been resplit from the dark-eyed. And there is still work going on with the yellow-eyed juncos that suggests that especially one of them, the so-called Guatemala junco or Highland junco, is a good candidate for a split. But as far as our dark-eyed juncos here in North America, I would be surprised to see them resplit anytime soon.
Kathy asked, which she has a comment too, Sibley shows red-backed having bicolored bill. Is that your experience?
Yes, it is in fact true that the lower mandible is yellowish or pinkish and the upper mandible bluish gray. I often don't see that in the field. What I often see in the field is a bill that is entirely bluish gray with a black culmen, the ridge on the upper mandible. I have not yet managed to come to terms with why I see that. I sometimes speculate that it is because I am seeing the reflection of the dominant color of the upper mandible in the lower mandible. Sometimes my angle is just such that I'm seeing a lot more of the upper mandible than the lower. So yes, the bill is bicolored. I tend not to be able to see it in the field as bicolored.
Joanne asks, what, if anything, tends to affect junco population numbers annually?
That is a really good question. I don't know that junco populations vary that much between years, but junco distributions vary between years. So in harsh winters, juncos will tend to go farther south and will create a greater impression of abundance. In milder winters, more of them will stay farther north, creating a different picture of abundance over their winter range. Obviously, juncos are subject to the same pressures as other birds: loss of habitat, predation, food failures. But for the most part, the juncos of North America, all of the kinds that we spoke about, are doing well as far as their overall populations.
Marilyn asks, have DNA studies been done?
Yes, lots and lots of them. There is a very good, relatively new book called Snowbird, published by Ellen Ketterson and her colleagues. And a couple of the chapters in that book deal with the genetic relationships between the juncos. And if I remember right, the notion is that the ancestral junco was a yellow-eyed junco, which moved into what is now North America, north of Mexico, not that long ago, and diversified into the various dark-eyed forms. My traditional bias as a birder born and raised in the northern part of North America thinks of the yellow-eyed junco as kind of the other junco, the derivative junco, the exotic junco. And it's interesting that these genetic studies have shown that the dark-eyeds are actually derived from a yellow-eyed ancestor. So if we think about a sort of basal junco, it's actually these exotic, weird-looking yellow-eyed juncos.
Susan asks, what food is best for the feeder for luring juncos. She's in California.
White millet, yellow and white millet, especially white millet, is the best way to go. It's sold in pet stores as canary seed for, slightly more than the equivalent amount of gold. But you can buy it at wild bird stores and feed stores as white millet. It has the advantage of being quite an inexpensive seed if you buy it in bulk, and it's the favorite seed of almost all feeder sparrows, especially juncos.
Gay wonders if you know when your Sparrows book will be available in soft cover.
I don't know. That's a good question. Last time I spoke with my editor at Houghton Mifflin about that, we did not have any date in mind. These reference guides, of course, are rather large in format. They're much larger than a typical pocket field guide, and so they tend to take longer to come out as paperbacks.
Kathleen says, living in Western Colorado, we often report about even numbers of Oregon and pink-sided juncos in the winter. After your comments, I'm wondering if we may be mistaken about the number of pink-sided. What are your thoughts?
Well, without seeing the birds, I can't say, but you're certainly in an area where you should be seeing lots of pink-sided juncos. Straight north of you, in Wyoming and western Montana, that is the breeding stronghold of pink-sided juncos, and lots of them move straight south. So I would not be surprised if you're seeing very large numbers of pink-sideds. Not surprised and envious.
Florian asks, in North American sparrows, are they threatened by malaria of birds that touch sparrows in Europe, notably the house sparrow?
I have not heard about malaria being a problem for sparrows in North America. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but I have not heard of that. I also hadn't heard that malaria was causing problems in house sparrows. That's interesting to know.
Denise says, I live in north of Quebec City and all juncos have disappeared since the end of November. I usually have them all winter.
I wonder what the ground cover is like. Juncos, slate-colored juncos, were originally known as snowbirds, of course, and they're still known as snowbirds to most people in North America. It's one of the very few North American birds that still has a genuine folk name, snowbird. And snow conditions actually move these birds around a lot in the winter. If the snow is too deep or if there's an ice layer on top of it, the slate-colored juncos will pull out and move south in search of places where the snow is not as deep or softer or ideally not present at all. So I think that probably in Quebec City, looking at the snow conditions and the ground cover is probably going to reveal some sort of correlation between junco numbers on any given day and a number of centimeters of snow on the ground.
Cheryl has a comment about feeding the birds. She says in Oregon, our birds hate millet. Cheryl, what do your birds like? What do you feed them with? Maybe you could give us an update on your feeding patterns. Robert says immature yellow-eyed juncos are dark-eyed, so perhaps this feature led to dark-eyed juncos.
That's possible. Yeah, it could be a sort of infantile trait that is retained in dark-eyed juncos. Hadn't thought about that, but it's possible.
So Cheryl did say she feeds sunflower seeds, seeds from native plants, and suet.
Yeah, juncos will eat suet. They don't eat much suet, but it's unusual for a day to go by that I don't see a junco working the suet block in our backyard. The question of regional tastes in birdseed is a really interesting one. I remember when I moved to Tucson, well, 17 years ago now, I remember just poo-pooing the notion that birds would eat milo, sorghum. And the sparrows in our yard in Tucson ate sorghum. Here, if I threw that seed out here in New Jersey onto the lawn, nothing would eat it. Maybe a grackle would come by and eat it. So yeah, they do obviously have regional differences in their preferences. Juncos, in my experience, will not eat the larger sunflower seeds. But of course, the seeds of wild sunflowers are relatively small, and I'm not surprised that they really enjoy the oil that they get out of those smaller sunflower seeds.
Roy has a question about your sparrow book and the range maps. He noticed and has a question why there are apparently no range maps, especially odd to me when the range of birds covered extends down to central Mexico, where U.S. birders are generally unfamiliar.
Yeah, we talked about range maps, and I thought that we could be a great deal more precise by using words rather than maps. I'll confess that sometimes when I find myself looking something up in that sparrow book, I sometimes wish there were maps. But I think that given that we are able in the distribution sections of the text to go right down to the county level and sometimes even to the city level, that we're able to give the reader a pretty impressive amount of precision. I do agree, though, a lot of the areas in Mexico, when I was writing those range descriptions, I usually had to have a map of the Mexican states in front of me on the desk so that I could remember which ones they were. That's simply US American bias on my part, but I do have a lot of sympathy there. Yeah.
Woody asks, a fellow birder had a photo of a white-eyed junco. Is that a light artifact?
Don't know without seeing the photo. That is very interesting. Eye color in sparrows tends to be quite constant. There are a few famous cases of sparrows that should have dark eyes having white eyes. A spotted towhee a few years ago I found had bright white eyes, the first one that I'd ever seen. It could be a photo artifact, or it could be the case that this bird, for whatever reasons in its genetic makeup, failed to develop the correct pigment in its eyes. I'd be really excited to see a photograph of that bird.
So Woody, will you send me a photo of that? Send it to ben@ventbird.com.
Thank you.
Lori and Stan say, we have seen birds from each of the major junco groups except red-backed juncos. Where and when could we see some of them?
Yeah, red-backed is in fact the last one that most people see. They breed in the mountains of west central New Mexico and east central Arizona, not moving very far from there in the winter. So if you are able to hit some of the mountain ranges north of the Gila River in New Mexico, and between the Gila River and the Four Corners reservations land belonging to the Hopi and the Navajo in northeastern Arizona, you should find them. This time of year, there's going to be a lot of snow up there.
Lisa, Cynthia, and Elaine all say great presentation. They loved it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And I also have several people that are asking for the links to your previous webinars. And so for everybody that registered today, you will receive an email tomorrow, and I will include those links to our YouTube and GoToStage page. So everybody will have those and they can go watch them on demand.
That's great, Ben. Thank you.
Oh, here, Elaine says, thanks from New Brunswick. I listened while watching birds outside in a brisk -5 degrees.
You can't beat talking about birds while you're watching birds. I like that.
Well, I think we might be at the end of our questions. And so
Okay.
I would like to thank everybody.
Yes. And Happy New Year to everyone.
We'll see you next time. Hopefully we'll see everybody in 2 weeks on Thursday, January the 14th.
Thank you, Ben. Bye now.
Bye, everybody. Happy New Year.